desert horizon, white sun over Arizona, a flat, endless expanse of sand and scrub trembling with heat, and then the aircraft, row after row, wing to wing, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, B-29 Superfortresses, hundreds, then thousands, stretching for miles in every direction, their aluminum skins blazing silver under a sky without clouds. No engines turning, no propellers spinning, no crews walking between the fuselages, just silence and metal and heat. 2 weeks earlier, these aircraft were flying combat missions over enemy territory. Their turrets were manned, their bomb bays were loaded, their crews were alive with fear and purpose and adrenaline. Now they sit in the dirt, waiting to be cut apart. How did the largest air force in history become scrap metal almost overnight? August 1945. The skies above planet Earth belong to the United States of America. No nation in history has ever assembled an air fleet of this size. No empire, no alliance, no civilization has ever concentrated this much destructive capability in the atmosphere. The United States Army Air Forces operate nearly 80,000 aircraft worldwide. Bombers, fighters, transports, reconnaissance planes, trainers, liaison aircraft. They sit on runways in England and Italy, on island strips across the Pacific, on fields in North Africa and India and China. They fill hangars in Texas, California, Kansas, and Georgia. They fly around the clock, around the globe, in quantities that defy peacetime imagination. The numbers alone are staggering. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the backbone of the daylight bombing campaign over Europe, has been produced in quantities exceeding 12,700. The B-24 Liberator, the most produced heavy bomber in history, totals more than 18,000. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber on Earth, the aircraft that has carried atomic weapons over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, numbers nearly 4,000. Tens of thousands of fighters fill the inventory. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks, and the transports, the unglamorous lifeline of every theater, the C-47 Skytrains and C-46 Commandos and C-54 Skymasters that have moved men and material across every ocean and every front. Behind these aircraft stands a production apparatus unlike anything the world has ever seen. American factories have manufactured roughly 300,000 military aircraft over the course of the war. In 1939, the entire U.S. military possessed fewer than 3,000 planes. By 1944, annual output alone has reached 96,000 units. The aircraft manufacturing industry, which ranked 41st among American industries before the war, has risen to first place in under 5 years. Assembly lines run 24 hours a day, 6 and 7 days a week. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a B-24 Liberator rolls off the line every hour. Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, North American, Consolidated, Republic, Curtiss, Grumman. These names have become synonymous with victory itself, and they have not worked alone. Automobile companies, tire manufacturers, appliance makers have all bent their capacity toward a single purpose. The industrial base of a continent has been pointed at the sky, and it has delivered. The Army Air Forces at peak strength number more than 2.25 million men and women. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, gunners, mechanics, armorers, clerks, meteorologists, intelligence officers, flight surgeons. They serve on over 700 permanent installations in the continental United States alone, with hundreds more overseas. In Europe, 149 combat groups have fought against Germany and its allies. In the Pacific and Far East, 86 groups are deployed by August. The total number of combat sorties flown by the AAF during the war exceeds 2,350,000. Over Germany, over Japan, over North Africa, over Burma, over the frozen Aleutians. The sky is American. The cost of this dominance is immense. The war has cost the Army Air Forces approximately $50 billion, roughly 30% of the total War Department expenditure. And the human toll is staggering. The AAF has suffered 12% of the Army's 936,000 battle casualties. 88,000 airmen have died in service. Total aircraft losses from December 1941 to August 1945 stand at 65,164. These are not abstractions. These are men who climbed into cockpits and never climbed out. Bombers that lifted off English runways and never returned. Fighters that dove into flak and never pulled up. But the machine has endured. It has expanded. It has overwhelmed. By the summer of 1945, the United States possesses an air arm so vast, so dominant, so deeply embedded in every theater of the global war, that nothing in the historical record even approaches its scale. And then the war ends. Subscribe if you want more hidden WWII histories told carefully. The end comes fast. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar delivers a second weapon over Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito broadcasts his surrender. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal documents are signed. The deadliest conflict in human history is over. And with peace comes a demand unlike any military order ever issued. Bring them home. The American public, the families, the mothers and fathers and wives and sweethearts who have waited years for this moment want their men back. Immediately. The pressure is instantaneous and enormous. Every congressman feels it, every senator, every official in the War Department. The country has 12 million men and women in uniform, 7.5 million of them stationed overseas, and the nation wants them returned to civilian life as fast as ships can carry them. The War Department implements a point system. 1 point for each month of military service. 1 point for each month overseas. 5 points for each battle star or decoration. 12 points per dependent child. Initially, 85 points are required for eligibility. Then the threshold drops, and drops again. By December of 1945, only 50 points are required. 10 aircraft carriers, 26 cruisers, and 6 battleships are converted into troop ships to bring soldiers home in Operation Magic Carpet. 1 million men are discharged from the military in December 1945 alone. The Army Air Forces are hit as hard or harder than any other branch. The manpower drain is catastrophic. Between August 1945 and April 1946, AAF strength falls from 2.25 million to just 485,000. A year later, it drops further to 304,000. Trained pilots, experienced mechanics, navigators who have flown 30, 40, 50 missions, armorers who can field strip a 50 caliber gun blindfolded. They are all leaving. They have earned enough points. They have families waiting. They want to go home. They are going home. No one can stop it. No one wants to stop it. The country has been at war for nearly 4 years. And the national mood is singular. The fighting is over. The boys are coming back. Everything else is a detail. But there is a detail, a very large detail. 80,000 aircraft do not maintain themselves. Every B-17 requires regular engine inspections, hydraulic checks, airframe assessments, corrosion prevention. Every P-51 needs its Merlin engine lubricated, its control surfaces calibrated, its fuel system flushed. Every C-47 needs its landing gear serviced, its radios tested, its tires inflated. Each aircraft is a complex, perishable machine. It deteriorates when it is not flown. It deteriorates when it is not maintained. It deteriorates faster in some climates than others. And now the men who maintain these machines are being discharged at a rate of tens of thousands per week. The institutional knowledge is walking out the door. By October of 1945, Major General St. Clair Street of the Continental Air Forces feels compelled to issue a warning. The Army Air Forces, he observes, have reached a point at which they can no longer be considered anything more than a symbolic instrument of national defense. In his view, what remains is not an Air Force. It is, in his estimation, a disorganized collection of personnel incapable of meaningful combat readiness. Installations are closing at an astonishing pace. On the day Germany surrendered, the AAF operated 1,895 installations, 1,333 of them within the continental United States. By the end of 1945, that domestic figure has been reduced to 429, including auxiliary fields. Entire bases that once hummed with flight training and operational readiness are now emptying out. The lights are going off. The runways are going silent. The control towers are going dark. And still the aircraft sit, tens of thousands of them, on ramps, on taxiways, on grass strips, on fields across two hemispheres, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. The war is over. The people have spoken. The budgets are collapsing. And the greatest air fleet ever assembled has no one left to fly it, no one left to fix it, and no mission left to justify its existence. The math is devastating. The United States has nearly 80,000 military aircraft in its inventory. Each one requires storage, preservation, periodic maintenance, parts, and personnel. Even in a reduced posture, even in a stripped-down peacetime configuration, the cost of keeping these machines alive is enormous. Consider a single B-17 Flying Fortress. 4 Wright R-1820 radial engines, thousands of pounds of aluminum airframe, hydraulic systems, electrical systems, oxygen systems, gun turrets, bomb bay mechanisms, navigation equipment, radio gear. Each subsystem requires inspection, lubrication, corrosion treatment, or replacement at regular intervals. Multiply that by 12,000 aircraft of a single type. Then add the B-24s, the B-25s, the B-29s, the P-51s, the P-47s, the P-38s, the C-47s, the trainers, the liaison aircraft, the reconnaissance variants. The sheer scale of the maintenance obligation is beyond comprehension. Hangar space is finite. Ground crews are disappearing. Spare parts inventories are scattered across bases on 6 continents. The logistical infrastructure that has sustained this fleet in wartime was fueled by a defense budget measured in tens of billions of dollars annually. That budget is now being slashed with the urgency of a nation that wants to rebuild its peacetime economy. And Congress has no appetite for maintaining idle war machines. Legislators have heard from their constituents. The war is won. The threat is removed. The veterans need jobs, homes, education. The GI Bill is law. The country is pivoting. And no senator is going to defend the cost of storing thousands of bombers that may never fly again. The approximate cost of storing a single aircraft runs to about $20 per month. That may sound small. It is not. Multiplied across tens of thousands of airframes, it becomes a staggering recurring expense. And storage alone is not enough. Aircraft that sit without preservation degrade rapidly. Tires rot. Seals dry out. Corrosion eats through aluminum skin. Engines seize. Instruments go dead. Without active care, an aircraft that was flight-ready in August becomes a hangar queen by Christmas and a hulk by spring. The military leadership understands this. The question is no longer whether to keep the fleet intact. That option is gone. The question is which aircraft to preserve, which to sell, and which to destroy. And the pressure is to destroy most of them. There is another force at work, one that few acknowledge openly at the time, but that shapes the calculus profoundly. The Air Force leadership is painfully aware of what happened after the First World War. Surplus aircraft from that conflict had flooded the market, depressed prices, and crippled the aviation industry for years. Old airplanes had become a political obstacle to procuring new ones. Congress saw hangars full of planes and refused to fund replacements. The next war, leaders reasoned, could not be fought with B-24s and B-17s. New aircraft were on the horizon. Jets, swept wings, pressurized bombers with intercontinental range. The old fleet was not just surplus. It was a potential roadblock to the future. By late 1945, responsible officials within the government have made the determination. The wartime air fleet is to be largely eliminated before any public clamor can arise for its retention on grounds of economy alone. The aluminum alloy recovered from scrapped aircraft is not even necessarily suitable for new aircraft construction. It is, however, perfectly suitable for consumer goods. And a nation emerging from rationing and wartime austerity wants consumer goods badly. The strategic calculation is complete. The aircraft will go. The only remaining question is where and how fast. As early as the beginning of 1945, before the war is even over, the Air Technical Service Command begins researching locations suitable for the mass storage of excess military aircraft. The criteria are specific and unforgiving. Coastal airfields are rejected. Salt air promotes corrosion and mold. Northern locations are rejected. Snow, ice, and freeze-thaw cycles accelerate airframe deterioration. Humid regions are rejected. Moisture penetrates every seam, every seal, every rivet line. What the service needs is heat, dryness, flat, open terrain with existing runway infrastructure, low humidity, minimal rainfall, conditions that will slow, though not stop, the decay of metal, rubber, and fabric. The answer is the American desert, Arizona, California, New Mexico, West Texas, Oklahoma. These states offer vast tracts of arid land, often with military airfields already built during the wartime training expansion. The runways are there, the taxiways are there. The flat, hard-packed ground can support the weight of heavy bombers parked on bare earth. Kingman Army Airfield in northwestern Arizona becomes one of the largest single-disposal sites in the country. The field has been built during the war as a training base for aerial gunners, and at its peak it trained 35,000 individuals. But after WWII Day, with no further need for gunnery students, the base winds down. By August of 1945, Kingman is placed on standby status. And by the autumn of that year, its new mission begins. Aircraft begin arriving, B-17, B-24s, B-25s Mitchells, B-26 Marauders, P-38s Lightnings, P-63 King Cobras, A-20 Havocs, even the rare consolidated B-32 Dominator, of which only 118 are ever built. 38 of them are flown to Kingman, many directly from the Fort Worth assembly line where they were manufactured. Brand new aircraft, never flown in combat, never assigned to a squadron, delivered straight from the factory to the graveyard. Active duty military personnel fly the aircraft into Kingman. Civilian employees handle parking and classification. Tent cities are erected on the field to house the growing workforce. As many as 150 aircraft per day are landing at Kingman during the peak influx. By the end of 1945, the total inventory on the field reaches approximately 4,700. Planes are parked by type, lined up in long, precise rows that stretch toward the Hualapai Mountains on the southern horizon. One row of aircraft, it is later reported, lines the railroad that parallels Route 66 for more than 4 miles. Travelers driving through the desert can look out their car windows and see an Air Force, silent and still, baking in the sun. But Kingman is only one site. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation establishes 5 large storage, sales, and scrapping centers for Army Air Force's aircraft, plus dozens of smaller facilities. By the summer of 1945, at least 30 sales storage depots and 23 sales centers are in operation across the country. Within a year of the end of the war, roughly 34,000 aircraft have been moved to 30 locations within the United States. In northeast Arkansas, Walnut Ridge Army Airfield becomes another massive collection point. The field, originally a basic flying school activated in 1942, covers more than 3,000 acres and has 3 5,000-foot runways and a parking ramp covering 63 acres. After the war, it becomes an ideal site for surplus aircraft storage. As many as 250 aircraft arrive per day. The estimated total flown to Walnut Ridge in 1945 and 1946 reaches 10,000 to 11,000 airframes. Fighters, bombers, trainers. Among them, at least 65 of the 118 B-32 Dominators, many straight from the assembly line, never having fired a shot. Altus Army Airfield in Oklahoma, Albuquerque in New Mexico, Ontario in California, Clinton in Oklahoma. Each site fills with aircraft row upon row, type by type, hundreds and then thousands, a silent armada grounded by peace. These are not anonymous machines. Many of them carry battle scars, patched flak holes in their fuselages, replacement panels that do not quite match, nose art painted by crews who loved them, names chosen in barracks, in tents, in Nissen huts on English airfields, names that invoked sweethearts and hometowns and dark humor and hope. These aircraft flew through things that would have destroyed lesser machines. They came home from Schweinfurt and Ploesti and Regensburg and Tokyo. They carried men through the worst skies in history. Now they sit in the dirt in Arizona, in Arkansas, in Oklahoma, waiting. Varies by site and by aircraft type, but varies by site and by aircraft type, but the general sequence is consistent. First, fuel is drained from every tank. The fuel has residual value and is sold. Then the engines are addressed. Oil is drained. In some cases, engines are removed entirely and placed in rows on the desert floor, separate from the airframes, their cylinders exposed to the sky. Guns are removed. By the time most aircraft reach the major storage depots, their ordnance, predominantly 50-caliber machine guns and classified Norden bomb sites, has already been stripped at earlier temporary collection points. But whatever remains is taken. Sensitive electronic equipment is pulled, radios, radar sets, navigation instruments. Anything with intelligence value or reuse potential is catalogued and shipped elsewhere. National insignia are painted out, though photographic evidence suggests that as the volume of arriving aircraft overwhelms the workforce, this protocol is often abandoned. The sheer pace of arrivals makes thoroughness impossible. What remains is an airframe. Wings, fuselage, tail section, landing gear. An aluminum shell, stripped of its purpose, parked in a row with hundreds of identical shells. Each aircraft receives a number. Each is logged in an inventory. The rows extend in every direction, precise and geometric. A pattern visible from the air that looks less like a military installation and more like an industrial warehouse. At Kingman, the aircraft inventory eventually includes 85 reconnaissance aircraft, 615 fighters, 54 light bombers, 266 medium bombers, and 4,463 heavy bombers. The overwhelming majority are heavies. B-17 and B-24s, the workhorses of the combined bomber offensive over Europe. These are the aircraft that have absorbed the most punishment, delivered the most ordnance, and carried the most men into harm's way. Now they sit, 12 abreast in some rows, their wings almost touching, their plexiglass noses clouding in the sun. At Walnut Ridge, the scene is similar. The vast concrete ramp fills with aircraft until there is no room left, and the overflow spills onto grass and packed earth. Fighters are stacked vertically in some areas, their tails pointed skyward, their propellers removed, their cockpits sealed. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, the fighters that had once dueled Japanese Zeros over China with the Flying Tigers, are piled like discarded tools. The idea, initially, is that some of these aircraft might be stored for future use. The Air Technical Service Command classifies the remaining fleet into categories. Some aircraft are designated obsolete. The jet revolution is underway, and machines like the P-38, the B-17, and the B-24 are already considered relics. Others, like the B-29, the A-26 Invader, and the C-47, are marked for the Strategic Aircraft Reserve, planes that might be recalled to service if a new conflict arises. But storage requires money, $20 per aircraft per month. Across thousands of airframes, the cost mounts rapidly, and the condition of the stored aircraft deteriorates with alarming speed. Some B-29s are preserved using a new cocooning process, in which the airframe is sealed in a protective covering. But the process traps heat and moisture inside the fuselage, damaging avionics and instruments. The cure proves almost as destructive as the disease. The idea of long-term mass storage is quietly abandoned. The cost is too high. The aircraft are degrading too fast. The political will to maintain them does not exist. What remains is disposal. The scrapping begins in earnest. At Kingman, the contract goes to the Wunderlich Contracting Company of Jefferson City, Missouri. They receive an 18-month federal contract for $2,780,000 to reduce 5,400 aircraft to aluminum ingots. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary demolition contracts in American history. The process is industrial. Acetylene torches cut through wings and fuselages. Hydraulic shears sever structural members. Aircraft that took thousands of man-hours to build are dismantled in a fraction of that time. The aluminum is separated from other metals, steel and copper and brass, each material sorted for its recycling value. The aluminum goes to smelters on site. It is melted down and formed into ingots, heavy bars of reclaimed metal that are loaded onto rail cars and shipped to factories across the country. Those factories are not building bombers. They are building refrigerators, washing machines, automobiles, aluminum siding, kitchen utensils. The consumer economy of post-war America is ravenous for metal, and the most readily available source of aluminum in 1946 is the air fleet that won the war. At Walnut Ridge, the Texas Railway Equipment Company purchases 4,871 aircraft, primarily fighters and bombers, for a bid price of $1,817,000. That comes to roughly $370 per aircraft. Bombers that cost the government hundreds of thousands of dollars each to build, bombers that required crews of 10 men to fly, bombers that crossed oceans and dropped hundreds of tons of ordnance on enemy targets, are sold in bulk for the price of a used car. 2 giant smelters are constructed on the southwest corner of the Walnut Ridge ramp. The scrap aluminum is melted down and formed into huge ingots for shipping. The recycled metal goes to manufacturers across the country, where it is turned into everything from toasters to mobile homes. The irony is total. Metal that has flown at 25,000 feet over Berlin, metal that has punched through flak and thunderstorms and enemy fighters, is now being reshaped into household appliances. At Searcy Field, near Stillwater, Oklahoma, the entire inventory of 475 surplus aircraft, including B-24 Liberators, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and P-40 Warhawks, is purchased by Paul Mantz, a Hollywood stunt pilot and aviation entrepreneur, for approximately $55,000. That works out to roughly $117 per aircraft. Mantz keeps 11 for his own use. The remaining 464 are cut up and shipped to St. Louis, where they are melted. He later jokes that he briefly owns the world's 7th largest air force, larger than China's. After draining the fuel from the aircraft and selling the gasoline, he reportedly recovers more than his entire purchase price before even touching the airframes. The surplus sales produce moments of dark absurdity. An operational B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber capable of crossing the Atlantic, can be purchased at the government's asking price of $13,750. But even that price finds few takers. At auction, B-17s sell for as little as $750. A Boy Scout troop purchases a B-17 for $350. Trainers sell for as low as $250 apiece. An entire Air Force is being liquidated at fire sale prices. By 1947, the War Assets Administration has disposed of approximately 65,000 aircraft. The total includes roughly 34,700 sold for flyable purposes and 26,900, primarily combat types, sold for scrapping. The scale of the disposal rivals the scale of wartime production itself. The smelters burn day and night, the ingots pile up, the rows of aircraft thin, and the aluminum flows into the arteries of the American consumer economy: refrigerators, car parts, window frames, bottle caps. The metal remembers nothing. Of all the aircraft consigned to this post-war reckoning, the fate of the B-29 Superfortress carries a particular weight. This is not just another warplane. This is the most technologically advanced bomber ever built. Pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets guided by an analog fire control computer, tricycle landing gear, a range that allows it to strike targets thousands of miles from its base. It costs the United States government approximately $3 billion to develop and produce, a sum that rivals the Manhattan Project itself. This is the aircraft that has burned Tokyo to the ground, the aircraft that has dropped incendiary bombs on 67 Japanese cities, the aircraft that has carried the atomic weapons that ended the war. The B-29 is not merely a bomber, it is the embodiment of American technological supremacy. A total of 3,970 B-29s have been built by Boeing, Bell Aircraft, and the Glenn L. Martin Company. In September 1945, following the surrender of Japan, all contracts for further production are terminated. Uncompleted airframes at the Boeing plant in Wichita are stripped of government-furnished equipment and scrapped on site. They never even leave the factory. Many B-29s go directly into storage. The aircraft that equip the Strategic Air Command when it is formed in March 1946 are Superfortresses. The silver plate modified aircraft of the 509th Composite Group, the only planes in the world capable of delivering atomic weapons, remain in active service. Some B-29s are converted for weather reconnaissance, signals intelligence gathering, and photographic reconnaissance. A small number are held in reserve. But for the majority, the trajectory is the same as for the B-17S and B-24s. Storage, then decay, then disposal. The cocooning process, intended to preserve the B-29 fleet in a state of readiness, proves problematic. Heat and moisture trapped inside the sealed fuselages damage instruments, avionics, and structural components. Aircraft that are carefully preserved in 1945 are found to be badly degraded when inspected a year or two later. The preservation effort, ambitious in concept, falters in execution. B-29s are parked at Pyote Army Airfield in West Texas, a desolate installation in the desert known informally as the Rattlesnake Bomber Base. They sit at Davis-Monthan Field near Tucson, Arizona. They bake in the sun at storage facilities across the Southwest, rows of them, their silver fuselages shimmering in the heat, their propellers still, their gun turrets locked in neutral positions. And then the scrapping begins for them, too. Not all at once. Not as quickly as the B-17 and B-24s, which are considered obsolete from the moment the war ends. The B-29 is still the Air Force's primary strategic bomber in the late 1940s, and some are maintained for that role. But the fleet shrinks steadily. Aircraft are pulled from storage, found to be degraded beyond economical repair, and sent to the smelters. By July 1946, the Army Air Forces have only 2 combat-ready groups out of 52 that remain on the active rolls. 2 out of 52. The rest exist on paper. Their aircraft are in storage, or in pieces, or already melted. The most powerful air arm in history has been reduced to a skeleton in less than a year. Then, in June 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, and suddenly the B-29 is needed again. Desperately needed. The Warner Robins Air Materiel Area literally unwraps and refurbishes hundreds of cocooned superfortresses, working around the clock, understaffed and frantic, trying to make flyable what has been sitting in desert storage for years. Some of these aircraft return to combat. They fly 20,000 sorties over Korea between 1950 and 1953. But many more are found to be too far gone, victims of the very storage conditions that were supposed to preserve them. The B-29 flies its last combat mission on July 27, 1953, over Korea, a superfortress of the 91st Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron. By then, the jet age has arrived in full. The B-36, the B-47, and soon the B-52 have made the superfortress obsolete. The remaining B-29s are retired, stored once more, and eventually scrapped. Of the 3,970 built, only 26 survive in complete form today. 24 of them reside in museums in the United States. Only 2 are airworthy. The aircraft that ended the deadliest war in human history has, for all practical purposes, vanished from the earth. Not every aircraft goes to the smelter. A fraction find second lives. Cargo planes are the most obvious survivors. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the DC-3 airliner, is one of the most useful aircraft ever built, and it is as valuable in peace as in war. Airlines snapping back to life after the war snap up surplus C-47s and C-54s, Skymasters. Small air cargo outfits in Asia, Africa, South America, and Alaska put these planes to work immediately. The C-47 will go on flying for decades, some surviving into the 21st century. Trainers, too, find homes. Stearman P. T-17 biplanes, the open cockpit trainers that have taught a generation of military pilots to fly, are sold for modest prices and go to work as crop dusters, air show performers, and weekend pleasure aircraft. They are small, simple, rugged, and cheap to operate. The availability of surplus machines allows all sorts of civilian flyers to take to the skies at bargain prices, seeding a general aviation boom that will reshape American culture. Some combat aircraft are transferred to Allied nations. Bulk sales agreements are negotiated with the British, French, and Italian governments during 1946. The first agreement, with Great Britain, carries a contract figure of $532 million. By the end of 1946, the Office of the Foreign Liquidation Commissioner in Europe has disposed of AAF property listed at substantial totals, including $47 million in aircraft alone. Equipment left overseas in Europe includes 24,000 spare aircraft engines, hundreds of thousands of long tons of technical supplies, and vast stores of bombs and ammunition. France, devastated by years of war and German occupation, needs to rebuild its air force quickly. Easy access to surplus American and captured German warplanes gives the French a bridge to new indigenous designs. Other nations in Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia purchase surplus American fighters and bombers to equip fledgling post-war air forces. P-51 Mustangs are exported to countries that could never have produced such machines themselves. A few B-17 end up overseas as survey and mapping platforms, flying for years in the service of foreign governments. Some aircraft survive through sheer chance and individual initiative. A handful of B-17S are purchased by civilians and converted for aerial photography, agricultural spraying, cargo hauling, and firefighting. One, sold for $750 as scrap at Altus, Oklahoma, in 1946, is eventually rescued, restored over the course of decades, and today sits in the EAA Museum in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, as one of fewer than 50 complete B-17 airframes remaining in the world. The Navy finds a use for a small number of surplus B-17S, converting them into PB-1W early warning aircraft equipped with long-range radar, among the first airborne early warning platforms in history. Desperate for airframes and spare parts in 1947 and 1948, the Navy even sends teams to inspect B-17s sitting in scrap yards in Oklahoma, hoping to buy them back from the very salvage dealers who purchased them as government surplus. But these are exceptions, rivulets against a flood. For every aircraft saved, 100 are destroyed. For every P-51 exported to an ally, 1,000 are torched. For every B-17 hauled out of a boneyard and given a civilian registration number, 5,000 are reduced to ingots. The numbers tell the story with cold precision. Approximately 34,700 aircraft are sold for flyable purposes. 26,900, primarily combat types, are sold for scrapping. The combat aircraft, the ones that actually fought the war, the ones with the battle scars and the nose art and the flak patches and the stories, these are the ones that overwhelmingly go to the smelters. The transports and trainers survive. The warriors do not. The speed of the collapse is astonishing. Consider the trajectory. In 1939, the entire United States military air arm possesses fewer than 3,000 aircraft and 26,500 personnel. By the summer of 1945, it has over 80,000 aircraft and more than 2.25 million men and women. A force built over 4 years of total industrial and human mobilization, an apparatus that has crushed the air defenses of 2 industrial empires and projected power across every ocean on the planet, and then, in less than 2 years, it is largely gone. Aircraft inventory drops from 79,000 to less than 30,000, and many of those remaining are in storage, not in service. Permanent installations are reduced from 783 to 177, just 21 more than the pre-war total. The Air Transport Command, which has sustained the entire military establishment worldwide, is trimmed from 9 divisions to 3, and by the end of 1946, its personnel are reduced by 80%. By July 1946, the Army Air Forces have only 2 combat-ready groups out of 52 remaining on the active rolls. A rebuilt Air Force of 70 groups, the authorized peacetime strength, is anticipated, but it remains a plan on paper. The reality is a hollowed-out force, short of men, short of equipment, short of training, short of everything except surplus aluminum cooling in the desert. The pace of elimination rivals the pace of wartime production. American industry spent years ramping up to produce 300,000 aircraft. The government dismantles the result in a fraction of that time. By 1947, the War Assets Administration has disposed of approximately 65,000 aircraft. The smelters have processed thousands of tons of aluminum. The scrapyards have cleared. In September 1947, a new era begins. The National Security Act establishes the United States Air Force as an independent branch of the military, separate from the Army for the first time in history. Stuart Symington is sworn in as the first Secretary of the Air Force. General Carl Spaatz becomes the first Chief of Staff, overseeing both the demobilization of the largest Air Force in military history and its rebirth as a new institution. But the new Air Force inherits a shadow of what once was. The wartime fleet is gone, the wartime manpower is gone. What remains is a small, underfunded force, grappling with obsolescent equipment, insufficient training, and an uncertain strategic mandate in a world that is rapidly dividing into 2 hostile camps. And the Cold War is beginning. The Soviet Union, which has reverse-engineered captured B-29 Superfortresses into the Tupolev Tu-4, is building its own strategic bomber force. The Berlin blockade of 1948 will test the resolve and logistics of the Western Allies. The Soviet atomic bomb test of 1949 will shatter the American nuclear monopoly, and in June 1950, the Korean War will erupt, demanding exactly the kind of air power that has been systematically dismantled. The military leaders who oversee the post-war drawdown are not fools. They understand the risks, but they are operating within constraints that leave them no room. The American public wants peace, Congress wants savings, the economy wants metal, and the wartime fleet with its propeller-driven bombers and piston-engine fighters is already being overtaken by technology. Jets are coming, swept wings are coming, missiles are coming, atomic strategy is coming. The old fleet represents the past, but the gap between the past and the future is a dangerous place to stand. And for several years in the late 1940s, the United States stands there, exposed, with an air force that exists more on organizational charts than on flight lines. By 1950, the wartime aircraft have largely vanished from frontline American service. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the symbol of the daylight bombing campaign over Europe, has been quickly phased out as a bomber after the war's end. Flight crews ferried the bombers back across the Atlantic and Pacific, and the vast majority were sold for scrap and melted down. A small number served on in second-line roles. Strategic Air Command used reconnaissance B-17 until 1949. The Air Rescue Service operated some as air-sea rescue aircraft. Over 100 were converted into unmanned drones for use in atomic testing, flying through mushroom clouds to collect air samples without endangering a crew. The last operational mission, flown by a USAF B-17, does not occur until 1959, when a drone controller, B-17, at Holloman Air Force Base directs a target drone for a missile test. A retirement ceremony follows. The era of the fortress formally ends, 14 years after the war, not with a bombing run, but with a remote-controlled target practice. The B-24 Liberator, the most produced heavy bomber of the war, fares even worse. It disappears from American military service almost entirely within 2 years of VJ Day. The B-24 is fast, it can carry a heavy load, and it has extraordinary range. But it is also considered more difficult to fly and more vulnerable to battle damage than the B-17, and in the post-war competition for survival, the Fortress outlasts the Liberator. Surplus B-24s are scrapped in enormous quantities. So few survive that today the warbird movement has markedly more B-17S than B-24s, despite the Liberator having been produced in far greater numbers. The fighters fare variously. The P-51 Mustang proves durable in post-war service. Some are retained by the Air Force and later redesignated F-51s, seeing combat in Korea as fighter bombers. But even the Mustang's numbers dwindle rapidly. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the massive Republic fighter that dominated the skies of Europe and the Pacific, is scrapped in vast quantities. So is the P-38 Lightning, the distinctive twin-boom Lockheed fighter. These aircraft, once produced by the thousands, become rare within a decade. The desert boneyards thin out. At Kingman, the Wunderlich contract is completed by July 1948, less than 3 years after the end of hostilities. 5,483 aircraft have been scrapped, generating $7.5 million in gross income from the recovered materials. The airfield is returned to Mohave County as a municipal airport. The smelters go cold. The rows of bombers are gone. Where thousands of aircraft once stretched toward the mountains, there is now empty concrete and desert scrub. At Walnut Ridge, the disposal continues until 1951. The 2 smelters used to melt the aircraft are themselves torn down the following year. The bricks from the smelters are used to construct a civil administration building at the airport. The instruments of destruction become building materials for peacetime infrastructure. Even the tools of the scrapping are recycled. At Altus, the last aircraft are processed by mid-1948. The field is turned over to the city for use as a municipal airport, only to be reopened in 1953 as Altus Air Force Base, which remains active into the present day. The concrete that once held thousands of war-weary bombers now supports jet transports and training aircraft of a different era. The few aircraft that survive do so in museums, in small collections, in the hands of dedicated individuals who recognize, even in the late 1940s, that these machines are irreplaceable artifacts. The warbird preservation movement, which will grow into a global phenomenon over the following decades, begins with a handful of people buying surplus aircraft for a few $100s and refusing to send them to the smelter. But they are a tiny minority. The overwhelming cultural and political consensus of the late 1940s is that these aircraft are spent relics of a finished war. Nobody wants to fly a B-17 when jets are breaking the sound barrier. Nobody wants to maintain a P-47 when the F-86 Sabre is on the drawing board. The old machines are not yet artifacts. They are not yet treasures. They are junk. And junk gets melted. Return to the desert. Arizona, 1946. Rows of B-17 flying fortresses stretch toward the Hualapai Mountains, their aluminum skins catching the flat white light of a Mojave sun. No engines run. No crews walk the flight lines. A lone steer wanders beneath a wing, seeking shade. The aircraft stand in perfect formation, as if awaiting a mission that will never come. Route 66 runs along the edge of the field, and a row of bombers extends alongside it for 4 miles. Motorists slow. They stare. They have never seen anything like this, and they never will again. This is what victory looks like when it has nowhere left to go. The United States of America built the greatest air armada in the history of the world. 300,000 military aircraft produced in under 6 years, an air force of 80,000 planes, crewed by 2.25 million personnel, projected across every theater of a global war. It burned cities, it sank fleets, it shattered armies, it dropped the weapons that ended the deadliest conflict in human history, and then it was taken apart, not by an enemy, not by attrition, not by defeat, by policy, by economics, by the irresistible logic of a democracy that builds what it needs for war and dismantles what it does not need for peace. The largest air fleet ever assembled did not fade slowly into obsolescence. It was eliminated at industrial speed. The same nation that perfected mass production of bombers perfected the mass destruction of bombers. The assembly lines ran in reverse. The smelters replaced the factories. The ingots replaced the aircraft. B-17 that had flown through walls of flak over Schweinfurt were sold for the price of a decent suit. B-24s that had crossed the Himalayas were stacked like cordwood in Arkansas. B-29s that had carried atomic fire were wrapped in cocoons and left to rot in the Texas desert. P-51s that had dueled Messerschmitts over Berlin were crated and shipped to scrapyards. The nose art faded. The names disappeared. The stories were locked inside the men who flew them, and many of those men never spoke of it again. Between 1945 and 1948, the smelters at Kingman, Walnut Ridge, Altus, Albuquerque, Ontario, and Clinton consumed tens of thousands of aircraft. The aluminum flowed into the peacetime economy. It became car hoods and screen doors and coffee percolators. It became the suburban architecture of a nation remaking itself after war. The metal did not know what it had been. The metal did not care. By 1950, when the Korean War erupted and the Air Force scrambled to reassemble a strategic bombing capability, the wartime fleet was gone. Frantic technicians at Warner Robins unwrapped stored B-29s and found corroded instruments, seized engines, ruined avionics. Some aircraft could be saved. Many could not. The reserve that was supposed to exist in case of emergency had been degraded by the very conditions of its storage. The lesson is not simple. It is not a story of waste or foolishness, though waste and foolishness played their parts. It is a story of scale, of what happens when a democracy mobilizes its entire industrial base for total war and then, almost overnight, decides the war is over. The machinery cannot be frozen in place. The politics will not allow it. The economics will not sustain it. The people want their sons home and their refrigerators full. And so the bombers are melted into refrigerators, and the circle closes. Today, at Kingman, Arizona, the original World War II control tower still stands. It casts long shadows over empty concrete. A museum in one of the surviving hangars preserves photographs and artifacts from the era when this desert field held one of the most powerful concentrations of air power on the planet. Visitors walk the grounds and try to imagine what it looked like. Thousands of aircraft, wing to wing, stretching to the mountains. They cannot imagine it. No one can. It was too large, too brief, too absolute. The sky-dominating fleet did not fade in battle. It did not fall to enemy fire. It was melted down, piece by piece, aircraft by aircraft, ingot by ingot, in a process as methodical and relentless as the bombing campaigns it once flew. The greatest air force in history had no enemy left to fight, no budget left to sustain it, and no future in a world that had already moved on. It was turned into scrap metal, almost overnight, and the desert swallowed every trace.